I think so often when it comes to our elected leaders, in his case, he's won a Nobel Peace Prize. Their legacies, their lives, it ends up being captured in these headlines, these snippets. But he has done more than I think most people know. And I think that sometimes it's like while we're sad at the loss, I'm also encouraged that it gives us some time to reflect on in more detail his legacy. Like when you think of President Carter, what do you remember him for?
So I remember when he was elected, and I remember it was a dividing line in my. Obviously I wasn't old enough to vote then, but it was a dividing line in my family. My dad voted for Ronald Reagan. My mom voted for Jimmy Carter. My mom never voted for anything but a Democrat, even though she was kind of socially conservative Catholic. She always felt like the Democrats represented the working man, so she always went that direction. Jimmy Carter is interesting. There's very few presidents that become more popular in hindsight, that history is kinder to than they were when they were president. But Jimmy Carter is one of those people. He actually had a relatively effective presidency, but he was defined by two things. Inflation that wasn't captured, although he put Paul Volcker in charge of the Fed, and ultimately that happened in his predecessors or successors' reign during Ronald Reagan. And secondly is Department of Education, which is now actually being threatened with elimination, and Department of Energy, which has been massively important for the United States. And so, weirdly enough, he was a much more effective president than initially people had the impression. Here's the weird thing about Jimmy Carter's presidency, though. This is one of the things that people don't realize. Not one military bomb was dropped. Not one military rifle was fired by the United States forces during his presidency. The only president of the 20th century where that happened. Literally the only one. That's it. And so, and remember, where did Jimmy Carter go to school? Where was he educated? The naval. He was a military man who actually had a very, I think, healthy perspective on when military is necessary and when it is not. Personally, I admire the guy. I think that he was probably he was a much better president. Historians would say the same than people gave him credit for at the time. But he came right on the heels of Watergate. Remember, his predecessor was Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is in U.S. history, the only never elected president. We've had other presidents, Lyndon Johnson. After Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson became president, but then he was subsequently elected. Not Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was the only unelected president in U.S. history. People were still pretty bitter about Watergate. They still felt very bad about, they lost anyone who had an idealized notion about the U.S. government lost it during that period of time. And so Carter bore the weight of some of that, the hostage crisis, certainly. And subsequently, we ended up probably voting someone out earlier than we should have. And I know that there's a bunch of people, probably listeners as well, who are big fans of Ronald Reagan. I'm setting that aside. I think that Jimmy Carter, I'm glad that history has been kinder to him, and certainly his post-presidential life was extraordinary. I think history's been kinder to him, and I think that that's a good thing. And that's something I remember him by after, 100 years on the planet.
And, taking this time to look back on, the origins of the establishment of the Department of Education in light of now this proposal, or at least an informal proposal to say, hey, we should get rid of it. Does it make you kind of think about, wow, is it something that should stick around? At the time, there was a lot of pressure from the Education Association, more funding needed, the FAFSA that we have now, kind of going back to that.
Right.
So could you imagine a world where we just go back to that time?
Well, the idea behind the Department of Education was to we have a problem in the United States with the disparity of quality of education depending on where you grow up. It's like what they often say about medical care. Sometimes your likelihood of surviving a serious medical issue has much more to do with your zip code than it has to do with your doctor. And that's the way education works as well. We have cities, public education, that we have cities where the public education is quite good, quite accomplished. Then we have areas in the country where it's awful. And the Department of Education was this idea to sort of even that out, make sure that people in disadvantaged communities were getting at least the same shot at education as people in advantaged communities. It hasn't always been able to accomplish that. I mean, weirdly enough, education is still largely controlled by the states. It's not controlled by the feds. I mean, I think it's easy to blame the Department of Education for a variety of things that it actually doesn't have any control over.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, right, was to give it this elevated,
Absolutely.
Having an elevated voice in the federal
Absolutely.
government, not for the federal government to have control.
Exactly. And the thing is that it just then that, I mean, in a weird way, maybe this is good as far as regional education goes. It became a bit of a heat sink for people's anger about education and educational quality and educational, what we decide to teach and what we decide not to teach in schools. It became kind of a heat sink for all of that while not really being in control of that. I mean, we interviewed, I think, Ursula and I interviewed Chris Reichdahl, superintendent of public schools in Washington State, about what would be the effect. He is a supporter of the Department of Education, but he said the education in Washington State will largely say pretty similar. Can they eliminate it? Will they eliminate it? I don't know. But it is a legacy of Carter, who felt like largely he's felt that government did have a role in improving people's lives, not the idea that you just get out of the way and let people improve them on their own, but you actually take an active role. I think it'd be interesting to see. I don't know enough about the Department of Education to say whether or not it actually accomplished some of that, but I think in some areas, like you mentioned, Fessa, I think it did.
Yeah. All right. President Carter dead at the age of 100, leaving office in 1981 and accomplishing so much more once he left office.